Explain like I'm 5. Why was Japan so strong during W2? Why were they such a huge power compared to the neighbors in the beginning of W2? Japan had made themselves a global player after the Meiji Restoration and was on par with regards to their navy with their Pacific peers like USA, UK, France, Russia. The Soviet Union had essentially moved most of their attention and focus to the European side of their country, especially with all of the nastiness going on with Stalin's rise to power, the purges, etc. What you get is the only westernized nation in that area that both has the might and the will to project beyond their own borders. They leveraged things like the Qing dynasty collapse to get footholds on the mainland and use their naval power to project their will onto several islands, including Taiwan. Their involvement in World War II was a culmination of events that predated Hitler, for sure. Add into that the Japanese way of doing things, combined with the new ideas of nationalism, backed up by years of fighting each other and repelling foreign foes, and you get a very militaristic country that needs an outlet. Hence, they became very strong. However, a lot of that strength was propped up by American oil and gas for their navy. One thing people don't tend to remember about Pearl Harbor is that it was one of something like 25 operations they started at the same time, including seizure of the Philippines and moving into Dutch Indonesia in an attempt to secure another source of oil and gas, because they were effectively cutting the cord with the USA. They also struck some serious blows with Pearl Harbor and enjoyed quite a bit of time as the preeminent naval power in the Pacific. The USA wouldn't respond at Guadalcanal for over 8 months, and even that was at the far border of Imperial Japan's claimed territories. It's like if somebody had struck back at the US by invading Alaska or Hawaii. They also struck some serious blows with Pearl Harbor and enjoyed quite a bit of time as the preeminent naval power in the Pacific. 6 months. Then midway, the IJN was pretty much on the defensive from that point on. Yes, they made offensive actions to attack the Allied fleets, but they did so to try to break Allied initiative. IJN offensive in the Philippines, an effort to repel the Allied invasion. IJN attack in the Marianas, an attempt to stop the Allied invasion. They got a lot done in those 6 months. Pearl Harbor was a successful attack, but they didn't accomplish their goal of crippling the US Pacific Fleet. We didn't strike out against them really until Guadalcanal, and then the fight was really on. Feels like minutia though. 6 months is a long time being top dog in the biggest ocean on Earth. They really weren't the top dog at all. In fact, they were weaker than the US and knew it, which is why their entire war plan wasn't even to try and win the war. They basically tried to seize a head start, dare the Allies to take it back, island by island, and hope that they could end up in a favorable treaty settlement, based on either A, holding out long enough for the war to run out the clock, or B, make taking Pacific territory back bloody enough that the Allies, SPUS, would get weary of the blood tax on victory and just cut them a deal. The Japanese military were skilled fighters, but the Japanese nation never had the industrial might to go toe-to-toe with the US, and knew it. They were on the clock from minute one. Even Pearl Harbor itself was a desperation play. Long and very complicated story short, the Perry expedition in the 1850s that forcibly opened Japan to the West made Japan as a whole realize that isolation wasn't going to work. Japan had also seen Western powers walk all over and/or colonize various Asian countries, and had no desire to join them. Cue decades and decades of modernization and westernization in an attempt to sit at the big boys' table, so to speak. By 1904, they were capable of taking on a major European power, Russia, and they only kept expanding from there. I mean, they weren't a huge power. They lost the war after all. But I understand what you mean. The Japanese were significantly more industrialized and organized than, say, China at the time of the war. The reasons for this have to do with events in the 19th century. In 1853, an American expedition arrived in Japan and convinced the Japanese government, with just a little teensy threat of war, to end their policy of isolationism and sign a trade treaty that would open their ports to the US and other countries. This was a huge shock to the samurai class, who had become pretty complacent with the situation over 200 years of peace and isolation. Suddenly, Japan was under threat of invasion, and the Japanese understood that the only way to survive would be to massively spend on defense, learn to use Western weapons, and modernize as fast as possible. This was not uncontroversial, of course, but luckily for the Japanese, there was a class of young samurai like Fukuzawa Yukichi, who, while they had very little actual contact with foreigners, had an interest in foreign languages and importing foreign books for some time. This relatively educated class was well situated in Japanese society to get cracking on the modernization, importing Western technologies, and implementing them as fast as possible. Now, this process did basically tank the Japanese economy and piss everyone off. The conservatives took it out on foreigners, whom they began attacking in the streets. Meanwhile, the other half of the country wants to modernize and spend even more money they don't have on guns and steam engines. One thing leads to another, and soon enough, the country is on the edge of civil war. This is really the critical moment in 19th century history for Japan. It could have ended in unending civil war for decades, but instead the war was luckily very short, and the modernizers were able to seize power, force out the old government, and restore Emperor Meiji to full power. The Meiji government proved to be pretty capable, and immediately set about reforming the government, taxation system, education system, military, practically everything. Because again, they figured the only way to survive against the threat of invasion by a colonial power was to become a colonial power themselves. So to that end, they went to war with China, taking control of Korea and Taiwan, which they promptly plundered. That conquest brought them into conflict with Russia, and to the surprise of pretty much everyone at the time, they won, thanks to some actually very good tactics and use of modern technology, and also the Russian Empire being bad at everything in the 19th century. By this point, the Europeans in the US couldn't really ignore them, so they said, yeah, sure, Japan, I guess you're an empire too, and they even got to technically be an ally in ww2 and come to the peace conference and everything, even while their government became even more militaristic and authoritarian at home. Explain like I'm 5. How come the moon spins at the same speed it orbits around Earth? It takes 27 days for the moon to spin completely, and the exact same time for it to orbit around Earth, thus creating a situation where we can always only see the same side of the moon. Surely, this synchronization is not a coincidence, but how exactly did we reach that point? I read some articles but found them vague. It's because of tidal locking. The moon is close enough to the Earth that the Earth's gravity makes the moon slightly oblong. The bulge of the moon that faces the Earth is pulled more strongly to the Earth than the rear and more strongly than the sides would be if it was turned 90 degrees. This means if the bulge of the moon ever began to turn away from the Earth would try to pull it back. Therefore, this bulge will try to always face the Earth, and it's this bulge that we see from the Earth's surface. Thanks, I think I understand. So basically, the orbit cycle is fixed by the distance between the moon and the Earth, but its spin speed was slowly adjusted by this tidal effect to match the orbit speed. Is that correct? You're right, it isn't a coincidence, and it's due to something called tidal locking. Before we go further, take a tennis ball, hold it at arm's length with the logo facing you, and have it orbit you such that the logo is always facing you. You will realize that if the ball did not rotate at all, when it got behind your head, the logo would be facing away. This would mean that the people on the world on the opposite side to your would be seeing the other side of the moon, which, as you established, doesn't happen. This means that the moon must be rotating constantly so that the logo side is facing Earth at all times. Now to explain tidal locking. We have known since the time of Newton in the 1600s that gravity is stronger on objects that are closer, and it increases by the square of the distance. For an object like Earth, which is very, very far away from the sun, the difference between the near and far sides is negligible, so the force on either end is roughly the same. Not so for the moon and the Earth. It's about 100 times closer, which means that the force on the near side is a fair bit stronger than the force on the far side. Natural consequence of this is that the near side never faces away from us. This isn't exclusive to the moon and Earth system either, by you. Mercury is tidally locked to the sun too, so it has one face absolutely scorched, and the other half is actually freezing cold because it is always facing away from the sun. Well, that's another episode of Explain Like I'm 5 in the books. I really appreciate all of you who made it this far into the video. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, it would really help the channel out a lot if you gave the video a thumbs up, subscribe, or leave a comment down below. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.